Thanks so much. Welcome to the session. Great to have you all here. My name is Janak, and I'll be taking the conversation today. I just wanted to start because it's called The Rise of Audio Storytelling, and I thought I'd read in a little bit and go like, what have we risen from and to? And I looked at a Guardian article from 2004, which is not that long ago, and they were talking about the rise of this new medium. They were still working out what to call it, and they were trying to work out, do we call it audio blogging, podcasting, or guerrilla media? And I'm glad we didn't call it guerrilla media. I think that was a win there. What I liked about this article, though, is I think it was quite incisive starting off. It was 2004. iPhones only came out in 2007, so they were really trying to work out what was going on. And the article quotes a journalist who was trying to work on it, saying, by combining the intimacy of voice, the interactivity of a weblog, and the convenience and portability of an MP3 download, Leiden, who's the guy he's interviewing, Leiden's work seems to take the best of all worlds and not just for the listener. The ability to broadcast out and to have the internet talk back to them is a very appealing to journalists, professional hack and web blogger alike. Leiden says, it's an approach to a different kind of radio, and my feeling is that traditional media in America is stuck and we need a new kind of radio. That's 2004. 2005, I'll stop talking soon. 2005, podcast is the Oxford English Dictionary's word of the year. So it had a moment. We went from, we don't even know what to call it, to it being the word of the year in 2005. And just this made me chuckle. The other contenders, this is a throwback, was bird flu, life hack, persistent vegetative state, Sudoku, and trans fat. So hope that's not triggering for anyone. Anyway, that takes us back to 2005. Anyway, where we are today, there is an estimated 5 million podcasts on Spotify. It is a huge, huge part of how we tell stories now. And very lucky to have three masters of the craft here with us. I'd like to introduce Paul Caruana Galizia, who works for Tortoise Media. He's won the Orwell Prize for his work and works both in print and audio. We've got Annika Blau, who works for the ABC for a program called Background Briefing and for a range of other programs. And Tito Ambyo, who's a journalism lecturer at RMIT and hosts a podcast called Talking Indonesia. So another round of applause for our wonderful guest here today. I want to just start off with a question to all three of you, and it's the most basic question, I guess, but like, why audio? And was there a moment for you, either as a listener or as a practitioner, where you said this, you really felt, I guess, like almost somatically, like this is a medium for me, this works for me? I'll start with Paul.
Oh, okay. So for me, it was really by accident, because I joined a company called Tortoise Media in 2018, and initially the company had been set up to do long reads online. Anyway, we proved not to be very successful at it, and we started experimenting with audio versions of these long pieces. Initially in a really straightforward way, you know, the author reading their piece with some production around it. But then it was only really during the pandemic that we started trying a bit harder at audio. And I was surprised to hear that you mentioned those quotes from 2004 and 5, because it felt like in 2020 was the year that people in the UK became completely obsessed with podcasts. I still don't know why. A lot of people anecdotally would say, I found it impossible to sit down and read. I was always like moving around the house. I wanted something to listen to. And so we found ourselves in the right place at the right time, and we started making narrative series. And for the company, that meant a group of people who mostly did print journalism suddenly had to start thinking in audio terms, and we had to hire producers, of course. But then they proved very successful, and for us as well, because we were able to place podcasts on bigger platforms, and luckily for a startup, we were able to suddenly reach millions of people. And we've never really looked back since then.
Annika?
I work for Radio National in Australia, which is our kind of national radio station, and it's where podcasts kind of started at the ABC because we had this long tradition of making beautiful audio with a lot of sound design. So I was very privileged to come into that unit and just discovered that making podcasts was a way to really transport the listener to a place in a way that I previously had written long-form text articles, and you just can't take them there in the same way as when you hear the sound, you're just transported to a place. And I think that's something that makes podcasts so unique. And we talk a lot about what's going to happen with the rise of AI, just churning out text-based journalism, but it won't be able to take people to a place and make them feel like they're there, and that's something that sets us apart. The other thing is, because we're a broadcaster, so much of what we've done over the decades has been TV, but to tell a TV story, you're limited to people who are willing to show their face. And some of the most special and compelling, impactful stories, the people that they've happened to don't want to show their face on national TV. So podcasting lets you tell a whole range of stories that you otherwise wouldn't be able to in a really intimate and personal way.
Tito?
Yeah, I think I agree with what you said, Annika. And I think, I grew up in Indonesia. I thought I wanted to be a theatre, like a playwright. I was so involved with theatre. So that's the storytelling part of me. But then, I moved to Australia, and I think I just found my people in radio, my people in audio storytelling. And I think it's the people, just like, this is what I wear to work as a radio journalist. And I love being able to do this every day, but also I think the craft, there's something about, I think there's a famous quote from that book called Living by Fiction, I think, where a painter was asked, how is it that you've become this amazing painter? And the answer was, I love the smell of paint. And I think for me, it's also the same. I just love
the T-shirts.
Yeah, exactly. I love T-shirts. I love also just the craft of layering audio. And when a good edit, when you do a good edit, it's just like it's so pleasurable for me, at least. I think that's what I found.
And I think for most of us growing up, we loved books to begin with, and most of us now work in sound. It was a career that just wasn't around. Are you surprised to find yourself work? I mean, you're also writing books and things as well, but are you surprised to find yourself in this career that wasn't even mapped out when you were young and sort of asked what you want to be when you grow up? You couldn't say podcaster. So, yeah, you're surprised to find yourself here, I guess.
I personally, slightly. I always wanted to make films, so I guess it's really related to that, and started out in documentaries. But I think at our end, they're not really surprised at all. They're sort of just like, well, this is what we've been doing for decades, and finally everybody gets it, which is really beautiful to be in that space.
Yeah, they finally got the memo.
Yes.
Yeah. Yourself, Paul?
I am surprised. I mean, a lot about the past 7 years has been surprising, but I am surprised because people connect to podcasts in a way that they don't seem to written pieces. They feel more connected to them, more attached to them. And I certainly never thought I'd be working in podcasts, and I don't think my editors did either, because as you're discovering, I speak very slowly. And one of them told me, after we recorded one of the first ones I made, I just wanted to speed you up the whole time. and then he said, but I then realized I'd have to speed everyone else up. I thought, we're never going to make it this thing.
I have to confess, I've listened to you on triple time. And I understood you just fine. So, nobody else, though. So I was,
Thank you.
Tito, tell me about,
Yeah, and I think this is related to what Paul is saying. I think the beautiful thing about podcasts, I'm surprised that, so many different people are doing podcasts now. And I think partly because, I think in Australia, I find a lot of journalists, radio journalists, broadcast journalists, who then move to podcasting, they do this, broadcast voice that just doesn't work. But meanwhile, I think a lot of the most popular podcasts actually, are hosted by people who are just a bit nerdy, a bit, they don't have that traditional, kind of broadcasting voice. And I think that's a beautiful thing, because I think now we're hearing more and more of audio stories told by people who wouldn't have wouldn't be given a job in radio if the radio was still the same as it was in 1980s.
Yeah, and people who talk very slowly.
With a Maltese accent as well.
With Maltese accent.
And
Very
That can
niche.
fly.
it's definitely opened a pathway for younger journalists to come in who wouldn't have been given a chance. Yeah.
Yeah, and accents as well.
Yeah.
Like if you have an accent and working in Australia, it's easier to do a podcast than try to find a job at, sadly, places like the ABC, for example.
Yeah.
Changing, but yes.
Essentially. Yeah, it's just much more democratic, isn't it? And you don't have to have that booming voice that we're used to on radio. I want to take us a little bit into each of your work specifically, and I'll start with you, Paul. So you've been working at Tortoise Media, and Tortoise has had an uncanny sort of success in a weird way. You've had multiple global hits. You've got Sweet Bobby coming out as a Netflix series like this week, I think it is. I saw that the series is... Who's listened to Sweet Bobby, by the way? Has anyone come across it? Okay, a few people. And yeah, Sweet Bobby is back in the podcast charts now, obviously on the back of it. So hugely successful. I'm curious just about Tortoise Media as an organisation. What is it in its DNA that has managed to pick so many winners so quickly?
The honest answer is we pick more losers, but obviously people don't notice. I think it's an unusual place in that it was set up by very experienced journalists, most from print, but one in particular, Kerry Thomas, from radio, so Radio 4, the Today programme, and who's one of these people with a real natural sense of what sounds good, what can be told well in audio. And so we had this group of very experienced people and then younger reporters kind of squashed together in a way that maybe you wouldn't have at a much bigger organization, a paper, the BBC, or so on. And so every day we'd have conferences which were very lively because we were a small number of people and very demanding, right? Because immediately you're put into a situation where you'd be having arguments with your editor-in-chief who owns the company, and you really need to know what you're doing and pitching. And I think another thing is because we got into this field early in the UK, or early for the UK, we kind of established trust with sources and listeners, and that really helped us. And we're now in a position where we have more coming to us than we can make. It was new, it was new for that country anyway. It wasn't kind of simple radio broadcasting. It was like a narrative told in a quite sensitive way, in a fun way. It just kind of landed in the right place at the right time, I think.
We'll go into some of the individual series in a second, but
Okay.
Annika, if you could just tell me about, so your main gig is with Background Briefing at Radio National. What's their remit, and I guess why are Australian taxpayers paying to have stories in this format, at scale? Yeah.
So what we do at Background Briefing is, it's immersive. So it takes people on a journey somewhere, and it is investigative. But a lot of the time, the way that investigations are delivered in media is not particularly creative. It's just, here's this hard-hitting thing that you need to know. And there's not a lot of attention always to the storytelling aspect of it. So what we try to do is, we're a narrative podcast. So fundamentally, we're telling people a story. And a lot of my executive producer gets a lot of pitches from people saying, I want to do an episode on this really important issue. But she says, we don't do topics, we do people's stories. And so I think that's fundamentally what makes a good podcast, and something that we kind of tend to forget is that narrative aspect. Our brains are hardwired to absorb information through stories. And if you look at cultures where information was just passed down in oral traditions, it's all passed down through stories, because that's how our brains store information. So we think that the fundamental thing has to be the story and the narrative, and that's going to help people retain what is important public interest information. So we look for interesting, important characters with crazy or surprising or compelling personal stories, and then we focus on telling their story, and through that, the issue comes out.
Tito?
Yeah, I mean, I don't produce narrative podcasts at the moment, but so what I do now is I'm a co-host of this podcast called Talking Indonesia. We're number one when it comes to a very nerdy niche podcast of Indonesian lecturers and academics.
Everyone's number one somewhere. You just have to, yeah.
But I think it's a wonderful thing because it's basically four of us. We take turns in hosting. It's not a lot of work, and our audience know what they're getting from us. And it also is a great way, I think, to help final year PhD students with a really cool research that just wants to practice talking about this their research. So yeah, it's been a really really good kind of experience just doing that.
And congrats on being number one too.
Yes.
I need to bag that. Yeah. Paul, I want to take us into some of the series you've worked on, and so yeah, Sweet Bobby's probably the Tortoise Media's big tentpole production, but you've worked on some other huge productions as well, and some very personal ones. I think it was the first series you did for them was about your mother's murder. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Great. Mate, just talk us into that and how that series came about.
It was a horrible way to start, really, and it was my first podcast and also the first series that Tortoise made. It came about through a young producer, actually. I wasn't keen on the idea, but a really good producer who works at Tortoise called Gary Marshall said, I really think it could work. I think we should try it.
Just to check, you weren't keen on talking about it at all, or you were
I don't
skeptical
know.
about the format?
No, it was more... So this, I should say, was towards the end of 2019. And it was a very strange period during my mother's murder case, where we had 3 hitmen in custody, but nothing else. So there was no movement on who ordered it. The court proceedings had more or less stalled. So I felt there was nothing to do or say. And anyway, one of our editors really insisted on it. And he said, just go to Malta and you'll figure it out. And I said, when do you want us to go? And he said, you decide. And I remember deliberately picking the 18th of November 2019 because there was nothing going on in the country. And I thought, I may as well go and see my father. And he picked Gary and me up from the airport. We went to Valletta to eat. And then it was nighttime. At about 5 a.m, so of the 19th, I got a message saying there's been a really crucial arrest, that it's happening right now, in fact. And it was the arrest of the man who's now charged with commissioning her murder. And he was arrested in a quite dramatic way. So his family owns this private marina. He had this big motor yacht. And at about 3 a.m, boarded it with his captain and tried sailing to Sicily and was intercepted by the armed forces. So, again, really quite dramatic. And that was a few hours after we landed in the country. And the week that followed, in fact, the months that followed, became some of the most exciting... it was one of the most exciting periods in modern Maltese history, really, because the government collapsed. There were protests, day and night across the country. It was extraordinary what was happening, and we just happened to be there, And it all came together from there. Of course, because he was arrested, he was then arraigned. Proceedings against him began, which produced a lot of evidence, and we were there for it, and it just fell into place in that way, and we made it pretty quickly in the end. So I think we released it in February, and it was again the first series. It was a moment for us at work, and a moment for the country, really. And when I look back on it, the stuff we got on tape, going to these protests, speaking to people, standing outside Parliament, the Prime Minister's office, it really is a kind of like a first draft of history, because the country went from never changing from independence in '64 to like changing completely in a matter of weeks, and we have it all on tape.
I was struck by your extraordinary timing when you were there and how much happened on the ground. And there's some extraordinary moments too where you've got sort of ordinary punters coming up to you, talking about the case and sort of trying to spitball what's going on, and they don't realise that you're Daphne's son. And nor do you let them know.
Maybe I should have, but it was.
No, there's a great restraint in that. I thought letting them go through. And these other moments where there's protests that are happening outside the palace, and you were there and recording in real time, effectively. And Tatu, we're going to try and play an extract if we could. I don't know if Tatu is still there. Just as they're teeing it up, just set the scene for this moment for us. It's in the fourth episode, the final episode of the series.
So it was a real. It was a real moment of catharsis for the country because my mother was killed in almost exactly 7 years ago, so the 16th of October 2017. And there have been a lot of political pressure, a lot of social tension in the country, a lot of disinformation, a very, very difficult period. The government at the time had been trying to force the murder out of people's minds, saying she was reporting on organized crime, of course it was going to happen. Meanwhile, the economy is growing really quickly, let's just be happy. And that went on and on and on for 2 years. And then with this man's arrest on his yacht...
We went.
Oh, here we go.
A thing...
Here's the extra.
We went. And what a thing it was. So the government MPs are leaving Parliament at the moment, and people are shouting out, corrupt, 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 out, corrupt. It became clear just how unprepared they were, and how unprepared the police force was. There were no extra officers there to guide MPs out of the building. The crowd kept moving in, closer and closer, up until it got right near the Parliament building entrance. And the crowd grew louder and angrier, started chanting more vociferously that the MPs are assassins, that they're mafia, and that they're corrupt. The boiling point came when Justice Minister Owen Bonnici emerged from the Parliament building. So there's a crowd of people stopping the Justice Minister's car from leaving Parliament. And they've crowded around his car, and they're hitting it and shouting out, corrupt, mafia, get out. Not only is Owen Bonnici responsible for justice in Malta, his department is also responsible for clearing the memorial to my mother, which he did every single day. And now a group of people have sat down, blocking the road, leading away from Parliament to stop the Justice Minister from leaving. Still, people are kicking at the bar, kicking it, shouting mafia. I've never seen people so angry, so worked up that they've thrown themselves in front of a cabinet minister's car to stop him from leaving Parliament. I mean, it is extraordinary. He's sitting in that car at the moment, unable to leave.
So it's an extraordinary moment.
It's funny how you forget things, but that thumping at the end was the sound of people banging on the windows of the Justice Minister's car. And that was right outside the Parliament building in Valletta. And to give some context, that government, which collapsed that week, was the most powerful in Malta's history since independence. It had an enormous majority. which also enabled a lot of the corruption it generated. So to see that happening, this crowd spontaneously gather around the Parliament building. I don't know if anyone's been to Valletta, but it's kind of open at the bottom. It's a beautiful modern building. And they surrounded it so that MPs, government party MPs couldn't leave. The Justice Minister made it out. And as you heard, people surrounded his car and stopped him from leaving. And it went on for ages. Felt like it went on for a lifetime. And he was just sitting there in the car, with people banging on it. Quite scary for him, I guess. But again, it was a moment of real catharsis because there was this complete government against the people tension that had been building up for 2 years.
I'm always struck by how transporting it is to hear the scene and just to be taken straight into it. Like in hindsight, are you grateful you did it in audio? Does it feel like the right medium that kind of honours your experience?
100%. I think that is a good example of things that do objectively work better in audio. I had a go at writing out that scene in a book, and I don't think it came off like that. There's nothing like hearing those voices.
Annika, might move to you. So you have worked on, dozens and dozens of programs for Background Briefing, for History Listen, and for other people. But we're going to hear an extract as well from one of your projects, and it's a family story that you're also going to be turning into a book, I hear. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And it started off in audio too. Could you just walk us into it? What's the story and what are we about to hear?
So this is an example of what you do when you don't have great tape, like Paul did. So that's kind of the goal. You want to be out in the field and capture something as it's happening. But because this is a history story, I had obviously no ability to go back to 1912 and capture the audio of my family in a prisoner of war camp. So instead, I had to just kind of use sound design and to kind of recreate what scenes I could. So this story was about, in the 90s, there was a tradie demolishing a house in Sydney and found underneath the floorboards 2 tea chests of mail. And he took them to a stamp dealership and was given $30,000 on the spot because of what was in them was so valuable. And the reason for that was that it was all mail that was collected in the prisoner of war camps that we had in Australia, where we interned people, what were called enemy aliens during the wars. And it had all been collected by my great-grandfather. But I didn't know this. I was just at work and I found that there was this random stamped collector who was doing exhibitions about my family, and he had all of our mail, and I couldn't understand who he was or how he had our mail of, family members I'd never even heard of. And so I tracked him down and convinced him to meet with me. And this is the opening of the series about that. And this is my attempt to use sound design to create a scene.
Beautiful. Tatu, can we play the second extract, please?
I don't know this man, but he somehow has a lot of information about my family, including personal correspondence that's over 100 years old. None of my family knew this, and none of us have ever met him. So I rock up to what looks like an ordinary brick cottage in Sydney's northern suburbs, but when I step inside, it's anything but.
There are clocks in every room in the house, and the one sort of clock that was missing was a cuckoo clock. And this one turned up about 2 years ago, and it's sort of finished my array of clocks around the house.
Paul Storm is a collector, and his house is a treasure trove.
That's how you wind it. You pull the weights up.
It's not just the multiple clocks in each room. Every wall and every surface is covered in Paul's collections.
I've only got that one.
I'd never seen stained glass in every window of a suburban home, but Paul's house was a first for everything. And laid out across the dining room table was Paul's most prized collection of all, my family's mail. My eyes were drawn to the name on an antique postcard. It was the name of my great-great-grandfather, Julius Blau.
That was a card sent to Julius, and it's addressed Vienna, 11th of January 1898. Dear Mr. Blau, my hearty congratulations for your elevation to 4711.
That's 4711, the oldest cologne in the world. My family worked as agents for the German perfume.
That's early for a picture postcard.
I feel like as audio producers, you've just struck gold when you walk in and there's cuckoo clocks on the wall.
Yes.
You're like, my story is off to a good start.
That you have to take the characters where you can find them. And, I didn't know anything about my great-grandfather. I had no ability to piece together who he was because none of my family were alive. But at least I could paint this character of this eccentric stamp collector. So you have to take the characters where you can find them.
I'm struck too just how visual that work is. How do you go about making it at least so that our experience is a visual one?
I think one thing I was taught is when you go out in the field, you need a notepad and you need to really describe what everything looks like while it's fresh in your mind. Take photos of the room that you're in, and then when you're scripting, it's so easy to forget that people can't see what you know to be the scene. And so you really have to script in, paint the scene for them. And every single podcast I make, the feedback still from my bosses is always like, more detail. What did the field look like? What did the person look like? What was their vibe? What was their energy? How did you feel when you spoke to them? So I think all of that helps bring it to life.
I'm curious too, now that you've been commissioned to write a book about it, do you think it would have happened the other way around for you? Would you have had the confidence in the idea or been able to demonstrate the idea without audio first? Like, at heart, is it an audio story for you, or was it always a book in waiting?
What I think was really interesting about making the podcast is that what I thought was interesting, other people didn't think was interesting, and vice versa. So I wanted it to be about the prisoner of war camps because I feel like we don't learn that much about them in Australia, and it's a really important part of our history. But my producer was like, people want to know about the perfume. Like, everybody knows 4711 perfume. They want to hear about that. They want to hear about the family feuds. They want to hear about the interpersonal family dynamics. And I was sort of like, but what's the public interest of that? But I think it's an important reminder that unless you have the people stories, people don't care about the public interest of the history of Australia's German concentration camps. So, yeah, that was a really important lesson that I'll take to the book when I write it.
Goes from there. Tito, both the extracts we've heard from Paul and Annika are, these very sound-rich, layered, scripted, narrated-driven things. Yours is a chat podcast, a bit lower production values. I'm curious just to take it into an Indonesian context briefly, and whether this sort of narrative, sound-rich format has worked here, and if not, why not?
No, that's a very good question. By the way, I don't know if this is too late, but just to let everyone know, I'm not Patrick Wynn.
Yes.
So if you see the name, unfortunately he can't make it, so I'm here replacing
Oh, thank
him.
you. Yeah, that's not Patrick Wynn.
I'm not
just
Patrick
confirming.
Wynn. I know very little about drugs in Southeast Asia. So. Sorry, what was the question again?
The question was, in an Indonesian context.
Oh, yes.
Yes, where are we?
No, I think there had been attempts. I think this is the thing. I grew up in Indonesia. I know that many Indonesians love chatting. We love listening to other people talk. But I think one thing that I've always been thinking about is how many of the journalists who are senior journalists in newsrooms in Indonesia, that the mecca is also American journalism, right? And I think as audio makers, that's also our mecca at the moment, right? Like WNYC, Radio Lab, This American Life. And I think often what happens, and this happens in Australia as well, I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what you think about this, but I think a lot of producers then try to make what Ira Glass is able to do in the US. But I don't think we can do what Ira Glass does with This American Life in Australia, just because people have different kind of cadence. People have different ways of sharing stories. And I think I've seen some attempts in Indonesia, for example, to do that narrative journalism. And I can see what they're trying to do, but it's like, oh yeah, it's just not really working. But there had been really good attempts. So KBR, which is the Kantor Berita Radio, which is the news agency in Indonesia, they've done some amazing podcasts, narrative podcasts. But I think maybe if you look at the most popular podcast in Indonesia, it's huge. A lot of Indonesians listen to podcasts. But I think narrative podcast, we're still trying to find a format that works. We're still trying to find a structure of storytelling that works. And I think one of the biggest questions that I have, and this is what I do when I teach my students as well, is that, I teach students the craft. I teach students listen to Radiolab, listen to This American Life, but don't allow craft to block you from actually listening to the world around you. Because often then what you do, if you fall in love with This American Life, then you start to search for this American life in the world instead of actually listening to what's happening around you and go, oh, that's the cadence that I want. That's the kind of audio scape that I want for my podcast. But if you're trying to find This American Life in Bali, it's not going to work. I think sometimes I see that, an American trained journalist trying to do that kind of storytelling in Indonesia. Meanwhile, we have, really good traditions of storytelling in Indonesia. We have amazing storytellers in Indonesia. Like I grew up listening to wayang kulit, which is like a shadow puppet performance for 12 hours, and I was awake for those 12 hours when I was 8 years old, and this is like a really vivid memory in my mind. But I haven't seen any podcasters trying to borrow from that tradition, for example. So I think that's something that I've been thinking about quite deeply as well.
We were talking earlier, and I'll out you both. That you said you don't listen to fiction podcasts, and so we'll park that briefly. But Tito, you mentioned that in Indonesia there's a tradition, or there's like martial arts fiction podcasts that are doing well.
And this is the thing. I think you said great tape, right? This is what audio journalists love, like great tape. And we also, I think audio journalists, we're very good at looking at a story and go, oh, that's not going to work as an audio story. That's TV or that's print. But I think maybe this is a part of craft that kind of blocks you from actually experimenting. Because in Indonesia, I grew up with, any Indonesians who can help me here, what is it called? The martial art drama, Saur Sepuh. So it's called Saur Sepuh. I grew up listening to this martial art radio drama every morning. I mean, if someone goes to a podcast producer and say, I want to do a martial art drama, I think no one would say yes.
I pitched it to the ABC and they didn't take it.
So I think this is going back to this what I was saying before. I think maybe we should actually learn from different traditions and see how did those producers manage to tell compelling martial art stories on radio.
To both Paul and Annika, I guess why hasn't fiction worked as well in podcasting? Do you have a hot take or a deep take?
It's not a deep take per se at all, but I tend to think that what we do is creative enough that I do kind of think of it like fiction, because we are thinking about the narrative and the storytelling and the cliffhangers at the end of every episode, and I often just forget that these are non-fiction stories. And I think, the creative non-fiction is so similar to fiction, but thinking about it, it is a really interesting idea, because so much of what we struggle with is needing to de-identify people who don't want to use their real name. And maybe there's a way to tell those stories by fictionalizing. I mean, telling their story and changing their name is not that different to writing a fiction podcast based on their lives. So.
Paul, any thoughts on that?
I have a no take, I'm afraid, but I think it's time for Q&A.
Time for Q&A? Okay, we're there already. Is
that right?
Questions?
Wow.
Over here and over there. Thank you for noticing that, by the way.
That's fine.
I was happily chatting.
Yeah.
I'm an anthropologist from Australia.
I think it's on. Maybe just put it right to your mouth. Yeah.
Is that right? Yes. Okay, I'm an anthropologist from Australia, and I grew up in the bush, and we grew up with radio, the ABC, and they had fiction all the time. Amazing radio plays. Would I be right to see a continuity between that and this discussion about putting fiction to a podcast scenario?
Yeah, they're still doing fiction podcasts, and I think one thing we spoke about was the opportunity for audiobooks, which are really, taking off to kind of merge a bit, to have a some of them are starting to incorporate sound design, and how can we find a kind of hybrid form where we use the best of audiobooks with the best of podcasts, the best of fiction radio programs, and bring it all together, radio dramas.
Yeah, and that's happening already, which is really exciting to see. Yeah. I think of The Archers as well on the BBC, which I think is one of the longest running, it's a radio drama that's been around for the longest time.
Blue Hills is the other one.
Blue Hills, okay, yeah, there's a few out there. We had another question over here. Loud.
I've got a question.
Okay, you got a mic?
Okay.
Sorry.
Look, I was wondering if I could ask a question, because I'm sure there are lots of other novelists here. When you're creating a podcast, a long podcast, are you looking at it in terms of things like character arc and reveal and the twist and the turn and all of those kinds of things that we as writers, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. We do a six-act structure for each episode, even though they're 30, 40 minutes long. And you are thinking about what are the key story beats, we like to think of it as peaks and troughs, and sometimes we draw it like a graph on the whiteboard. And so, you have your lull, and then you come up to a peak, and then your next reveal. And so you are thinking about what you hold back, what you tell, how you unfold the story. There's a lot of thought that goes into it.
I might ask Paul as well. You've been part of some very, very successful productions that have clearly nailed the art of storytelling through sound, just in a very nerdy craft sort of way, picking up on that. How do you make it? What does it look like in the room?
The answer is yes, and the most successful stories we've done in podcast form have been ones where you've got a really compelling protagonist, where there are really unexpected turns in the story, and where there's this really nice arc. So Sweet Bobby is an obvious one. You have the central character, Kirat. There's one we did about the son of a Russian oligarch who followed this kind of extraordinary arc that you could only have in England, that did quite well. And really it often starts from there, actually, from a character. Someone would come into the office with a piece of gossip about a man or a woman, and you never believe what happened to this person, and then we'd start looking at a timeline of what they've been up to, and that's again that is really how most of the really successful ones started.
Over there, thanks.
Given the examples we just heard, how do you grapple with journalistic objectivity when telling those deeply personal family stories?
So in the podcast about my mother, there's of course no use or point in even pretending you're anything other than who you are, and that you're telling a personal story in the first person, and so you've got to be upfront with the listener, and they know what they're getting into. I've only ever done that, you know what I mean? The other ones have all been stories external to my life, and that's made things easier. I mean, there are still difficult questions about how much of your voice should be on it, how people react to you on tape. But I just think you've got to be very upfront.
I might use this moment just to talk quickly about The Master as well, which is your most recent series. And you've talked about it being one of the most difficult things you've worked on. It looks at the sexual allegations or allegations of sexual abuse against Neil Gaiman, best-selling author. Why was it so difficult? And what did you struggle with in that?
It was a horrific story. I've only ever done 2 sexual assault stories before. One was very straightforward, but this was much more difficult because the allegations are from women who were in some kind of a relationship with him, even if just sexual. So there was a mixture of consensual and non-consensual acts, which we had to, unpick. And it was difficult also because the sources in these stories are very vulnerable. So if you're doing a story about politics or corruption, then the sources involved are used to being asked questions, used to journalists, in short. Whereas a young woman with a history of trauma who's making allegations of rape and assault is a very different story. And you spend a lot more time with them. And then if there are multiple allegations, which in that podcast there were, so it's 5 women in the end who recorded interviews. And I worked on that from the start of February this year till more or less now, doing nothing but weekends, nights. And it was very graphic. Another problem with it was the nature of the sex was important to the story. And so we ran into all sorts of constraints in law around privacy and defamation. And I remember even before we were months away from publication, we had run into legal costs of tens of thousands of pounds, just taking advice on what we can say, how we can say it. There was a child involved as well, which made things very complicated. Very complicated. I would say those stories I found the hardest by a long way.
Would that story have existed in print and had the impact it had? I mean, again, was audio the key here?
I think there were moments where I thought, why do we have to do it as a podcast? It's a nightmare, because you have to ask these women to record interview after interview. But then I thought, because of who he's quite a very popular author who presents as very progressive, woke, a feminist. He calls himself an ally. And so when we published, there was this real dissonance. It can't be true. It can't be true. And I think that would have been much more of an issue were it a print piece. But as a podcast, of course, you could hear the women. You could hear their voices and the anxiety, the fear in their voices. And you had that times 5, And so I think, in short, it was more effective in audio. Yeah.
It's a very difficult listen, but I'm always again struck by how much information is encoded in a voice. We just understand what's happening emotionally by the slight modulations. It's
100%.
Annika, just quickly taking up that question about objectivity and I guess your position as a narrator within this. Do you ever feel any discomfort about how much of your voice goes into it, or how do you position yourself relative to the story?
I think it's just really important to have a robust structure around you of people who are independent from the story, who can give you that feedback. I also had to just decide that some people in my family wouldn't be happy with it, and that was okay, and you have to be okay with that. I was fortunate that my parent, who's related to the story, died when I was a child, so that wasn't something that I had to consider. But I do think, you need to be okay with upsetting people in your own family in order to uphold your kind of journalistic principles, because mine was all about the family secrets, and at some point I had to be like, these were things that they went so far out of their way to hide. Should I really be telling the whole of Australia? But I just decided that, I think that they're worth telling. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, maybe just at the front here. And then after that, the person at the back there with the hat, please.
Hello. Hi. I actually have 2 questions, one serious, one fun. The serious one is kind of around the idea of ethics of journalism in podcasting. You guys are part of media networks and probably have some journalism education, but podcasts can also be done with a guy and a recorder and their phone and editing software on their computer in their basement. And do you see a risk or a slippery slope of the ethics of journalism with podcasting and podcasts being created with people who don't understand the risks that come with doing investigative journalism? That's my serious question. My fun one is, what podcasts are you enjoying right now? What's been your favorites lately? I love recommendations. Thank you.
Let's start with Tito.
Oh, okay. The serious question. I think one of the problems that we have at the moment, I feel, and of course I'm biased, I'm a journalism lecturer, but I feel a lot of people, we have failed in telling people how much work journalism is. People just think that when you publish things that look like journalism, it's journalism. That's why we have people who go to places and interview people and they say, this is journalism. I was like, well, no, that's not journalism. That's just you recording a video. And I think that's the challenge that we need to actually tackle. We need to be able to tell people, hey, this is what journalism is. It's not what you see. It's what you don't see. That the amount of work that people put before they even press record. And I think that's, if you're not a journalist, I think this is why I also say, please subscribe to good journalism. Pay good journalism because it's expensive. Doing this amazing podcast, journalistically solid podcasts are very expensive. But also, just to add a little bit to what Rio was asking about the objectivity as well, I think that the tension here is between authenticity and objectivity. When people are listening to audio, wearing their $300 headphones, they want authenticity. They don't want that projecting kind of voice of broadcast media. So I think all of you have done that very well, in terms of hitting that balance between authenticity and objectivity. And this is where I tell you about the podcast that I'm enjoying right now, which is Janak's podcast, Australia Fair. Listen to it. It was released yesterday, I think.
No, on Monday.
Monday, yeah. It's a beautiful podcast
and
about
why is it so good,
policy.
Tito? don't answer that. Annika.
Yeah, I do think it's a real concern that anyone can make a podcast, but I don't think that's specific to podcasts. I think we also see that with, anyone can publish now an online article, and what is the editorial framework around that, and same with videos like on YouTube. So I think it's kind of the cat's out of the bag. I'm not really sure what we can do about it other than educate people about, what trusted organisations can offer. And in terms of the flip side of that is that you're hearing from all these voices you otherwise wouldn't have, who are now able to find an audience, and people who didn't have broadcast training, but you might never have heard from that scientist or whatever. In terms of what I've enjoyed listening to, there's a podcast called The Girlfriends, which is about a group of New York women who, one of them dated this guy in the 80s, and they had this joke that what did you kill your first wife? What happened to her? Anyway, it turns out he did, and they solved the murder. And it's a bit controversial because there's so much of their banter and rapport because they are just best friends, solving this murder. And some people are like, oh, that's too, light for the subject matter. But I think it's actually really brilliant because it makes you feel like you're with your friends. And what we talk about so much in our work at Background Briefing is finding the light and the shade, because if it's all shade, like a lot of investigative journalism is, no one wants to listen to that. And so that having that, so much of podcasting is about the rapport between the hosts and the journalists, and I think having The Girlfriends is just a perfect example of when you have that inbuilt rapport with your friends, of how much that can lift the subject matter.
Paul, I might just ask you to share your favourite podcast, and we'll get one more question and we'll knock off.
Time out. But the
okay, 2 minutes, 1 minute.
I don't know if I can come up with a favourite just yet, but Tortoise just released one called Elon Spies. It's by Alexei, who did Sweet Bobby, and it's about Musk's use of private investigators in his private life, personal life, which is I know a bit about, obviously, just by being at the office, and I think that's a good story. The stories that really don't work in audio are unfortunately the stories that investigative journalists really love, which are based on documents, which can be quite dry. So if you think about stories like the Panama Papers, it's hard to see that becoming a podcast. It would be better served in a written piece, I think.
But everything else, podcasts.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Big round of applause to our wonderful guests, Tito, Annika, and Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, as well.
Thank you.